What happens when evil no longer hides? What happens when corruption becomes normal? When lies become entertainment? When violence becomes ordinary? When people stop feeling shame for the things that once horrified humanity? Can a single person remain good when the entire world around them begins collapsing morally? This is the question at the heart of the story of Noah. And perhaps it is also one of the most important questions of the modern age. For thousands of years, people have remembered Noah as the man who built an ark, the man who survived the flood, the man who saved humanity from extinction. But beneath the animals, the rain, and the ancient imagery lies something far darker and far more psychological. The story of Noah is not only about a flood, it is about civilization itself. About what happens when an entire society slowly loses its moral center. According to Genesis, the world before the flood became filled with violence. Corruption spread everywhere. Human beings stopped restraining themselves. Evil no longer shocked society. It became woven into everyday life. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part of the story. People adapted to it. Because human beings can adapt to almost anything, even darkness. History proves this repeatedly. Entire civilizations have normalized cruelty before collapsing under the weight of it. Empires celebrated excess while rotting internally. Nations ignored moral decay while distracting themselves with entertainment, pleasure, and power. Humanity often recognizes destruction only after it becomes irreversible. And maybe that is why the story of Noah still feels disturbingly relevant today. Modern civilization is more technologically advanced than any society before it. Yet many people feel humanity is becoming emotionally exhausted and morally confused. Endless distraction, endless outrage, endless consumption. Social media rewards anger. Algorithms reward division. Pleasure becomes obsession. Truth becomes negotiable. People increasingly ask, what benefits me? Rather than, what is right? And perhaps the greatest danger is not that evil exists. Evil has always existed. The greatest danger is when people stop recognizing it as evil at all. Because civilizations rarely collapse overnight. They collapse slowly, internally, morally, spiritually, long before they collapse physically. And in the middle of this corrupted world stood one man, Noah. Not a king, not a warrior, not a ruler. Just one ordinary human being trying to remain righteous while surrounded by a civilization moving in the opposite direction. Imagine the loneliness of that. Imagine building an enormous ark for decades while the world laughs at you, while society mocks you, while everyone around you believes you are insane. Most people fear being wrong, but perhaps human beings fear something else even more. Being alone. Because standing against society comes with psychological pain. Isolation, ridicule, rejection. Human beings naturally conform to groups because belonging feels safe, which raises a terrifying possibility. How many people silently compromise their values simply to avoid isolation? Noah represents the rare individual willing to stand against the crowd even when misunderstood. And perhaps that is why his story survives thousands of years later. Because every generation eventually faces the same question. Can a human being remain morally awake? Inside a civilization slowly falling asleep. Maybe the story of Noah is not only about the destruction of the ancient world. Maybe it is a warning about every society that slowly loses its soul. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part of all is how familiar the world before the flood begins to feel today. The world after Eden did not become evil overnight. Corruption rarely appears all at once. It grows slowly, quietly, almost invisibly at first. One compromise, one act of selfishness, one generation drifting slightly further away from truth than the generation before it. Until eventually people forget what goodness even looked like in the beginning. According to Genesis, humanity multiplied across the earth. Cities grew, families expanded, civilization advanced. On the surface, the world may have appeared successful, productive, powerful, alive with human activity. But beneath the growth of civilization, something darker was spreading inside the human heart. Violence, corruption, moral decay. Scripture describes the condition of humanity with one of the most chilling lines in the entire Bible. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. Think about how extreme that statement is. Evil was no longer occasional. It became habitual, continuous, normalized. Humanity had not simply committed sinful acts. Human consciousness itself had become distorted. And perhaps that is one of the deepest warnings hidden inside the Noah story. The greatest danger to civilization is not isolated evil, but collective evil accepted as normal. Because human beings adapt psychologically to repeated behavior, what shocks society at first eventually stops feeling shocking. Violence repeated enough becomes entertainment. Corruption repeated enough becomes politics. Lust repeated enough becomes culture. Lies repeated enough become accepted truth. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to normalize darkness. History proves this constantly. Entire empires collapsed, not only because enemies attacked them externally, but because corruption hollowed them internally first. Rome expanded in power while decaying morally. Wealth increased while discipline weakened. Pleasure replaced virtue. Entertainment replaced wisdom. And perhaps modern civilization struggles with similar patterns today. Humanity lives surrounded by unprecedented technology and comfort, yet many people feel emotionally exhausted and spiritually empty. Endless stimulation floods modern life. Social media, advertising, entertainment, pornography, dopamine addiction, constant distraction. Human attention itself has become a battlefield. And perhaps one of the greatest modern dangers is not open evil, but endless numbness. People no longer have time to reflect deeply. Silence disappears. Thought disappears. Wisdom disappears beneath constant stimulation. The world before the flood may have looked outwardly advanced, yet internally humanity was collapsing. Genesis specifically says the earth became filled with violence. Violence is important here because violence represents more than physical harm. Violence reveals the breakdown of empathy. Once human beings stop seeing each other as sacred, cruelty becomes easier. Dehumanization spreads. Power dominates compassion. Strength dominates morality. And perhaps that is what happened before the flood. Humanity lost its ability to restrain itself morally. People increasingly acted according to impulse rather than wisdom. Desire became authority. Pleasure became purpose. Self-interest became normal. And maybe that reflects one of the oldest dangers in human nature. Civilizations often become vulnerable when comfort replaces discipline, because discipline requires sacrifice, restraint, patience, responsibility. But pleasure offers immediate reward, immediate escape, immediate gratification. Human beings naturally drift toward comfort unless something higher guides them. This is why many ancient philosophers feared societies obsessed entirely with pleasure. Because civilizations focused only on consumption eventually lose the strength to preserve themselves. Modern culture often promotes the idea that happiness means satisfying every desire immediately. Do what feels good. Follow your impulses. You deserve pleasure. But the Noah story quietly warns that civilizations without self-restraint become unstable over time. Human desire without moral boundaries eventually becomes destructive. Another terrifying aspect of the pre-flood world is this. People likely no longer believed they were corrupt. Evil becomes most dangerous when it stops feeling evil. Human beings justify almost anything once enough people participate together. Crowds shape morality more than individuals realize. If an entire society celebrates selfishness, selfishness begins feeling normal. If a culture glorifies greed, greed becomes ambition. If a generation constantly consumes violence, violence becomes entertainment. Humanity adapts emotionally to repeated exposure. This is why moral collapse often happens gradually rather than dramatically. People drift, one compromise at a time, until eventually nobody remembers where the line originally existed. And perhaps this explains why civilizations throughout history repeatedly ignored warning signs before collapse. People become emotionally attached to comfort. They resist uncomfortable truth. They mock anyone challenging the culture around them, which brings us to Noah himself. In the middle of a corrupted civilization stood one man described as righteous. Imagine how isolated that must have felt. Noah was not merely living among imperfect people. He was living inside a society where corruption had become collective. That changes everything psychologically. Because resisting individual temptation is difficult, resisting entire cultures is far harder. Human beings are social creatures. People naturally imitate the behavior of crowds. Social approval shapes identity deeply. This is why standing against society feels emotionally painful. People fear rejection almost instinctively. Fear ridicule. Fear isolation. Fear becoming outsiders. Noah represents something psychologically rare. A person willing to remain morally separate, even when surrounded by collective corruption. Most people conform because belonging feels safer than conviction. Entire societies throughout history participated in injustice simply because individuals feared standing alone. Noah refused that path, and perhaps this is why his story matters so much today. Modern society constantly pressures people toward conformity. Online culture rewards group thinking. Algorithms reinforce emotional tribes. People fear saying unpopular truths because public humiliation has become immediate and global. Standing against the crowd feels dangerous psychologically. Yet Noah's story suggests something profound. Truth does not become false simply because the majority rejects it. Another important detail appears in Genesis. God becomes grieved by humanity's corruption. This is deeply symbolic. The flood story is not merely about punishment. It is about heartbreak. Humanity possessed enormous potential for beauty, wisdom, creativity, and goodness. Yet civilization increasingly chose violence, selfishness, and corruption instead. Perhaps this reflects one of the greatest tragedies of human existence. Human beings possess the capacity for extraordinary goodness, yet also extraordinary destruction. And civilizations are shaped by which side humanity chooses to feed collectively. The world before the flood became a society where restraint disappeared, meaning disappeared, moral boundaries weakened, human appetite became limitless. And maybe that is why the story still feels disturbingly modern, because many people today sense something similar happening beneath the surface of contemporary civilization. Endless consumption, endless distraction, endless outrage. Yet increasing loneliness, increasing anxiety, increasing emotional instability. Technology continues advancing rapidly, while the human soul struggles to keep pace. And perhaps the deepest warning in the Noah story is this. Civilizations rarely collapse only because of external threats. Often they collapse because internal corruption slowly destroys the moral foundations holding society together. The pre-flood world may have looked powerful externally, but internally humanity had already begun drowning long before the rain ever fell. And in the middle of that drowning world, one man continued building an ark. Noah was not merely building a boat. He was building resistance against an entire civilization. And perhaps that is why his story feels so psychologically heavy. Because the hardest part was probably not the flood. The hardest part was the loneliness that came before it. Imagine the scene. Year after year, Noah continues building an enormous ark, while the world around him continues living normally. People marry, trade, celebrate, laugh, consume, distract themselves. Meanwhile, one man spends decades preparing for a disaster nobody else believes is coming. How insane must Noah have appeared to society? A man building a giant ark under clear skies. A man speaking about judgment while civilization continues functioning normally. A man refusing to follow the direction of the culture around him. And perhaps this reveals one of the deepest psychological truths about human beings. Most people fear social isolation more than moral failure. Human beings are wired for belonging. Acceptance feels safe. Rejection feels painful. Throughout history, survival often depended on remaining part of the tribe, which means standing against the crowd creates enormous emotional pressure. Noah was not only resisting temptation, he was resisting collective conformity. And collective conformity is one of the most powerful psychological forces in human civilization. People often assume they think independently, but history repeatedly shows how easily crowds shape morality. Entire societies normalize corruption once enough people participate together. Good people stay silent because isolation feels dangerous. Individuals compromise values to avoid rejection. Crowds redefine truth emotionally through repetition. Noah stood against all of that alone. Imagine the ridicule he likely endured. Mockery, humiliation, whispered conversations, laughter. People probably saw him as paranoid, delusional, fanatical. Human beings often mock what exposes their own discomfort, because Noah's existence silently confronted the corruption surrounding him. Righteousness becomes threatening to societies that normalize darkness. Not because goodness attacks people, but because goodness reminds people of what they are avoiding. This still happens constantly today. Individuals who challenge cultural trends are often ridiculed first before being understood later. Whistleblowers, reformers, truth-tellers, people resisting corruption. Throughout history, many individuals standing for truth experienced isolation before recognition. Because crowds rarely welcome uncomfortable warnings, human beings prefer reassurance over confrontation. Noah represented confrontation. His ark itself became symbolic. Every hammer strike reminded society that consequences might exist. Every plank of wood silently challenged civilization's confidence. And perhaps that is why Noah's isolation matters so deeply psychologically. Because loneliness becomes especially painful when surrounded by people who believe you are wrong. Most people can endure hardship more easily than social rejection. Many individuals betray their own convictions simply to remain accepted. Students follow destructive trends to avoid exclusion. Employees stay silent about corruption to protect careers. Friends laugh at things they privately know are wrong because they fear standing apart from the group. Noah resisted that pressure for decades, which raises an uncomfortable question. How many people today would continue building the ark once the mocking began? Human beings often underestimate how much crowds influence them emotionally. Solomon Asch's famous psychological experiments demonstrated that ordinary people would knowingly give incorrect answers simply because groups pressured them socially. People often distrust their own judgment once isolated from collective approval. Noah experienced the opposite dynamic entirely. He trusted truth over consensus. And perhaps that is one of the rarest forms of courage. Because society often assumes the majority must be correct, but history repeatedly proves otherwise. Entire civilizations once defended slavery, violence, tyranny, corruption. Moral blindness spreads easily when enough people participate together. Noah's story warns that popularity and truth are not always aligned. Another psychologically important detail is this. Noah obeys without visible proof. God tells him, "Build the ark." Yet no flood exists yet. No rain. No catastrophe. No evidence visible to society. Noah acts entirely through faith before consequences appear. This makes his isolation even more profound, because human beings naturally seek external validation before committing fully to difficult paths. People want certainty, approval, evidence, support. Noah had almost none of these things, and perhaps modern life reveals how difficult this truly is. People often abandon truth when rewards are delayed. Discipline collapses when results are invisible. Relationships fail because commitment weakens under pressure. Human beings struggle to remain faithful to what cannot yet be seen. Noah spent years preparing for something the world considered impossible. And maybe that reflects another painful truth about humanity. Civilizations often ignore warning signs until consequences become unavoidable. People ignore debt until collapse arrives. Ignore emotional exhaustion until breakdown arrives. Ignore addiction until destruction arrives. Ignore moral decay until trust disappears completely. Human beings naturally avoid uncomfortable truths because immediate comfort feels emotionally easier. Noah represented long-term vision in a short-term world. Another profound aspect of Noah's isolation is emotional endurance. Strength is often misunderstood. Many people imagine strength as aggression or dominance, but Noah represents a quieter kind of strength. Perseverance. The ability to continue doing what is right without applause, without validation, without social support. Perhaps this is one of the hardest psychological challenges any human being can face, because external approval strongly shapes motivation. People work harder when admired, feel safer when accepted, feel more certain when supported by crowds. Noah experienced almost none of this, yet he continued building, day after day, year after year. And maybe this is why the ark itself becomes symbolic far beyond the flood story. The ark represents preserving truth while surrounded by corruption, preserving discipline while surrounded by indulgence, preserving meaning while surrounded by distraction, preserving morality while society drifts toward chaos. Every generation must build some form of ark psychologically. Otherwise, culture slowly consumes identity. Modern society creates endless pressure toward emotional conformity. People increasingly shape opinions around online approval. Fear public criticism, fear cancellation, fear exclusion from social tribes. Yet Noah's story suggests something important. Integrity sometimes requires standing alone temporarily, and that loneliness comes with real psychological cost. Isolation can create doubt, exhaustion, emotional fatigue. Even righteous people grow tired. Noah was still human. He likely questioned himself at times, wondered whether people were right about him, wondered whether the years of labor meant anything. Human beings naturally crave reassurance, but perhaps true conviction begins where reassurance disappears. Another fascinating aspect of Noah's story is that corruption often appears attractive socially. People around Noah were likely enjoying themselves, pleasure, entertainment, freedom from restraint. Noah's disciplined life probably looked restrictive compared to the surrounding culture. This still happens today. Modern society often mocks discipline as boring, mocks restraint as weakness, mocks morality as outdated. Yet civilizations built entirely on pleasure eventually weaken internally, because immediate gratification slowly destroys long-term vision. Noah resisted that cultural drift, and perhaps this reveals why moral courage is so rare. It usually requires sacrificing short-term approval for long-term truth. Most people struggle deeply with that exchange. Another painful truth hidden in Noah's isolation is this. People often reject warnings because accepting them would require changing themselves. If Noah was right, then society needed repentance, responsibility, transformation. But transformation feels painful to pride. So mocking Noah became emotionally easier than confronting corruption honestly. Humanity still behaves this way constantly. People attack uncomfortable truths rather than examining themselves. Entire cultures sometimes silence voices exposing moral decline because awareness threatens comfort. Noah's Ark stood as physical evidence that someone still believed accountability existed. And perhaps that idea itself felt offensive to a civilization obsessed with its own desires. Yet, despite all the isolation, Noah continues building. This persistence becomes one of the most powerful psychological lessons in the story, because real integrity is revealed not when truth is popular, but when truth becomes costly. Anyone can stand for goodness when crowds applaud it. The real test comes when righteousness creates loneliness instead. Noah passed that test, and perhaps that is why his story survived thousands of years later. Not because he built a giant ark, but because he refused to let a corrupted civilization reshape his soul. In the end, Noah's greatest battle may not have been against the flood itself. It may have been against the emotional pressure to become like everyone around him. And perhaps every generation faces the same battle in different forms. The pressure to compromise, the pressure to stay silent, the pressure to follow crowds instead of conscience. Noah reminds humanity that sometimes survival begins long before catastrophe arrives. It begins the moment a person chooses truth over conformity, even if they must build the ark alone. How does an entire civilization become corrupt? How do millions of people slowly drift away from truth together? Why do societies repeatedly normalize things that once would have horrified previous generations? These questions sit at the center of the Noah story, because the flood was not simply about individual sin. It was about collective moral collapse. Humanity did not fall alone. Civilization itself became corrupted, and perhaps that is what makes the story so disturbing. Evil becomes far more dangerous when it is shared socially. An isolated, immoral person can still feel guilt. But when entire cultures normalize corruption together, conscience itself begins weakening. Human beings are deeply influenced by the environment around them. People rarely form values independently. Families shape morality. Communities shape morality. Culture shapes morality. Repetition shapes morality. This is why societies often drift slowly rather than collapse suddenly. Corruption becomes normalized one compromise at a time. At first, something feels wrong. Then it becomes tolerated. Then accepted. Then celebrated. And eventually anyone questioning it becomes the outsider. History repeats this pattern constantly. Entire civilizations once normalized slavery, public executions, human sacrifice, extreme inequality, violence as entertainment, propaganda, corruption. Humanity adapts psychologically to repeated exposure. What shocks people repeatedly eventually stops shocking them. And perhaps that is one of the greatest dangers facing every civilization. Not the appearance of evil, but emotional numbness toward it. The world before the flood became filled with violence. That phrase suggests more than occasional cruelty. Violence became woven into society itself. Human beings stopped restraining destructive impulses. Power became more important than morality. Desire became more important than wisdom. And perhaps this reveals something ancient inside human nature. Without moral boundaries, desire expands endlessly. Human appetite rarely stops itself naturally. Wealth seeks more wealth. Power seeks more power. Pleasure seeks more stimulation. Ego seeks more validation. Without self-restraint, civilizations eventually become consumed by excess. Ancient philosophers understood this deeply. Plato warned that societies obsessed with pleasure eventually weaken themselves internally. Aristotle believed discipline was essential for stable civilization. Even Roman historians described moral decay long before Rome physically collapsed. Luxury increased. Discipline weakened. Entertainment expanded. Meaning diminished. And eventually the civilization lost the inner strength required to preserve itself. Perhaps Noah's world experienced something similar. Externally, civilization may have looked successful, but internally humanity was spiritually exhausted. Modern society often reflects the same tension. Humanity possesses unprecedented comfort and technology. Yet, rising anxiety, loneliness, addiction, and emotional instability. Why? Because material advancement does not automatically create moral or psychological health. A society can become technologically brilliant while emotionally collapsing underneath. Another reason societies become corrupt is because people imitate crowds instinctively. Human beings fear social rejection deeply, which means many individuals privately disagree with immoral behavior while publicly conforming to it. This creates collective dishonesty. Entire societies sometimes participate in things most individuals internally know are wrong. Why? Because isolation feels psychologically painful. The famous psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated this through conformity experiments. Ordinary people knowingly gave incorrect answers simply because groups pressured them socially. People often distrust their own judgment when separated from collective approval. Noah stood against exactly this force. He resisted the emotional gravity of the crowd, but most people do not, which means corruption spreads socially faster than people expect. One compromise influences another. One generation normalizes behavior, the next generation inherits automatically, and eventually nobody remembers where the moral line originally existed. Another dangerous aspect of societal corruption is pleasure addiction. Human beings naturally seek comfort and stimulation. Modern civilization monetizes this constantly. Endless entertainment, endless scrolling, endless dopamine. Humanity now lives surrounded by systems designed to capture attention continuously. And perhaps this creates a civilization increasingly distracted from deeper reflection. The world before the flood may not have lacked intelligence. It may have lacked restraint. This distinction matters deeply. Intelligence alone cannot save civilizations. Highly intelligent societies can still become morally confused. Knowledge without wisdom becomes dangerous. Technology without morality amplifies destruction. Humanity learned how to manipulate the external world faster than it learned how to govern the internal world. And perhaps this imbalance defines modern civilization itself. People increasingly know how to stimulate themselves, but not how to discipline themselves. Another reason societies become corrupt is the loss of shared meaning. Human beings need moral frameworks larger than personal desire. Without higher meaning, pleasure often becomes the substitute. But pleasure alone cannot sustain civilization long term. Why? Because civilizations require sacrifice, responsibility, self-restraint, long-term thinking. Communities collapse when every individual pursues only personal gratification. The Noah story suggests humanity before the flood became consumed by self-centered living. Violence spread because empathy weakened. Empathy weakens when people become emotionally disconnected from one another. Modern life can intensify this disconnection. Social media creates constant interaction, yet often shallow connection. People communicate endlessly while feeling increasingly alone. Isolation grows, anxiety grows, meaning weakens. And psychologically isolated societies become more vulnerable to corruption because disconnected individuals focus increasingly on themselves alone. Another terrifying aspect of moral collapse is this. Corruption often disguises itself as progress. Every civilization believes its current values are enlightened, yet history repeatedly humbles humanity. Future generations often look backward and ask, how could people justify that? Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What modern behaviors might future civilizations view the same way? Humanity often becomes morally blind inside its own cultural moment. That is why self-awareness matters so deeply. Noah's world likely believed itself normal. Corrupted societies rarely recognize themselves as corrupted. Evil becomes ordinary gradually. People adapt emotionally. Another major cause of societal corruption is the collapse of truth itself. Once truth becomes negotiable, morality becomes unstable. If every individual creates personal truth independently, shared ethical foundations weaken. Trust collapses. Community fractures. Civilization becomes emotionally fragmented. Modern culture increasingly struggles with this tension. People often prioritize subjective feeling over objective truth, but feelings constantly change. And civilizations built entirely on emotional impulse become unstable over time. Noah's story quietly suggests that societies require moral anchors stronger than temporary desire. Otherwise, collective drift becomes inevitable. Another profound detail in the Noah narrative is how long corruption continues before judgment arrives. This matters psychologically. Human beings often mistake delayed consequences for safety. If nothing bad happens immediately, people assume behavior must be acceptable. But consequences frequently develop slowly. Debt accumulates silently before collapse. Addiction grows silently before destruction. Moral decay spreads silently before civilizations fracture. Humanity often confuses patience with permission. Noah spent years building the ark while society continued functioning normally. People likely interpreted normalcy as proof that Noah was wrong. Yet catastrophe was already approaching, invisibly. Modern civilization still behaves this way. People ignore warning signs because immediate comfort feels convincing. Climate instability, mental health collapse, loneliness epidemics, social fragmentation, addiction, debt, declining trust. Many warning signs emerge long before systems visibly collapse. But societies resist uncomfortable truth because transformation requires sacrifice. Another reason civilizations become corrupt is because human beings increasingly prioritize image over character. External appearance becomes more important than internal integrity. Reputation replaces virtue. Performance replaces sincerity. Modern culture intensifies this dramatically. People curate identities constantly. Online approval shapes behavior. Visibility becomes currency. Yet civilizations weaken when appearance matters more than truth, because eventually trust disappears beneath performance. Noah represents the opposite principle. Integrity without applause, conviction without popularity, truth without validation, and perhaps that is why he appears so isolated. Truly moral individuals often look strange inside corrupted cultures, because righteousness exposes compromise automatically. Another terrifying aspect of societal corruption is how quickly crowds turn against individuals resisting them. Noah likely endured ridicule for decades. People often mock moral conviction because it exposes hidden guilt. If Noah was right, then society needed to confront itself honestly. But self-confrontation feels painful. So, attacking Noah became emotionally easier than transformation. Humanity still behaves this way constantly. Societies often silence uncomfortable voices rather than examine uncomfortable truths. Yet history repeatedly vindicates people willing to stand against destructive cultural momentum. And perhaps that is the deepest warning hidden inside the flood story. Civilizations rarely collapse only because evil exists. They collapse because enough people stop resisting it. The world before the flood drowned long before the rain arrived. It drowned morally, spiritually, psychologically. The flood merely revealed externally what had already happened internally. And maybe that is why the Noah story still feels haunting today. Because every generation eventually faces the same terrifying possibility, that civilizations can appear powerful on the outside, while quietly collapsing from within. The sky had always looked safe before. Ordinary. Predictable. People woke up that morning, expecting life to continue as it always had. Markets would open. Conversations would continue. Children would play. Families would eat together. Civilization still believed itself secure. And perhaps that is what makes catastrophe so psychologically terrifying. Disasters rarely announce themselves in ways people are willing to believe. Human beings assume normality will continue indefinitely. Until, suddenly, it does not. Noah had spent decades building the ark, while the world mocked him. Decades of warning, decades of isolation, decades of preparing for something invisible. And still, society continued living as though consequences would never arrive. Because human beings are deeply skilled at denial, people ignore warning signs constantly when truth feels uncomfortable. Individuals ignore emotional exhaustion until breakdown arrives. Nations ignore corruption until systems collapse. Civilizations ignore moral decay until trust disappears completely. Humanity often mistakes delayed consequences for permanent safety. The world before the flood believed tomorrow would always resemble today. And then, the rain began. Perhaps at first it did not even seem frightening. Just drops against the earth. Water falling from a darkening sky. Ordinary enough to dismiss. Human beings always struggle to recognize irreversible moments while they are still beginning. But the rain continued. Harder. Longer. The sky darkened further. Rivers swelled. Panic slowly entered human consciousness. And perhaps somewhere in the distance, people looked toward the ark for the first time differently. Not as madness, but as possibility. This may be one of the most haunting psychological moments in the entire Bible. The realization arriving too late. Humanity often waits until consequences become undeniable before taking truth seriously. By then, change becomes far more difficult. Noah enters the ark with his family. Animals gather. The enormous structure standing for decades in silence finally reveals its purpose. And then Genesis says something chilling. The Lord shut him in. The door closes. Imagine the emotional weight of that moment. Outside stands an entire civilization. Inside stands one family surrounded by uncertainty. The closing of the ark door symbolizes something psychologically devastating. There comes a point where ignored warnings become irreversible consequences. Human beings desperately want endless time to change, endless opportunities, endless postponement. But reality often operates differently. Some consequences arrive slowly, then suddenly all at once. The floodwaters rise, panic spreads, civilization begins collapsing under the force of nature itself. Buildings disappear, roads vanish, landscapes transform into chaos, and perhaps for the first time, humanity collectively realizes how fragile civilization truly is. Modern people often forget this. Cities create the illusion of permanence. Technology creates the illusion of control. Wealth creates the illusion of security. But beneath all human achievement remains vulnerability. Nature can still humble civilization instantly. Disease, war, economic collapse, environmental disaster. Human systems appear stable until suddenly they are not. The flood strips away humanity's illusion of invincibility. And perhaps that is one reason the story continues haunting civilizations thousands of years later. Because deep down, human beings know how fragile the world truly is. Another terrifying aspect of the flood is collective blindness. Humanity ignored Noah for years because normal life continued uninterrupted. People naturally trust visible stability more than invisible warning. This still happens constantly. Societies prioritize short-term comfort over long-term survival. People continue destructive habits while assuming consequences remain distant. Why? Because immediate pleasure feels psychologically stronger than abstract future danger. Noah represented long-term vision in a world obsessed with present comfort. And perhaps this is why societies often reject prophets, reformers, and truth-tellers. They disrupt emotional comfort. They challenge the illusion that everything is fine. But civilizations attached to comfort rarely welcome uncomfortable truth. The flood also symbolizes the collapse of human arrogance. Before catastrophe, people often assume life is controllable, predictable, manageable. Humanity believes intelligence and power can master reality completely. Yet disasters reveal limits brutally. The flood reminds humanity that civilization remains vulnerable despite all progress, and psychologically, vulnerability terrifies people. Human beings constantly seek certainty, control, stability, but the flood destroys those illusions entirely. Water rises higher, panic spreads further, screams echo. Humanity confronts something it spent decades denying. Consequences are real. Another disturbing aspect of the story is this. People likely mocked Noah until the very end. Human pride resists surrender, even during collapse. Throughout history, civilizations ignored warnings repeatedly because admitting danger requires humility. Pride whispers, everything will continue normally. Nothing will happen. We are different. You're safe. But catastrophe often arrives precisely when societies become most convinced of their permanence. The flood becomes symbolic not only of divine judgment, but of reality itself, finally confronting human denial. Then comes another emotionally devastating truth. Noah survives. But survival itself carries enormous psychological weight. Imagine standing inside the ark while the world outside disappears. Imagine hearing the storm for days, weeks, watching civilization vanish beneath endless water. Noah's obedience preserved life, but it also separated him from everything familiar forever. Sometimes surviving catastrophe still wounds the soul deeply. Modern history reveals this repeatedly. War survivors, refugees, survivors of disasters, pandemics, social collapse. Many survive physically while carrying invisible psychological scars afterward. Survival itself can become traumatic. Noah likely carried memories impossible to erase. Panic, fear, death, the collapse of an entire world he once knew. Another haunting aspect of the flood story is silence. Eventually, the screaming stops. The rain continues, but civilization disappears beneath the water, and the ark drifts through emptiness. Imagine the emotional loneliness of that image. One family floating above the grave of an entire civilization. This is no longer merely a story about punishment. It becomes a story about grief, loss, trauma, the unbearable weight of witnessing destruction. Noah's Ark becomes both salvation and isolation simultaneously. The people inside are alive, but separated from the world they once belonged to. Perhaps this reflects another painful truth about moral conviction. Sometimes preserving truth requires separation from corrupted systems, but separation itself comes with emotional cost. Another profound lesson hidden in the flood narrative is this. Civilizations often believe they are too advanced to collapse, yet history repeatedly proves otherwise. Every empire imagined permanence. Every civilization believed its structures would endure forever. And yet all eventually faced vulnerability. The flood symbolizes the fragility hidden beneath human confidence. No amount of technological progress can fully remove moral responsibility. No amount of power can fully eliminate consequence. And perhaps modern civilization still struggles with this illusion today. Humanity grows increasingly powerful technologically, while often remaining emotionally immature. Spiritually, knowledge expands faster than wisdom. Capability expands faster than restraint. And the Noah story quietly warns what happens when civilization loses moral foundations while increasing in power. The flood becomes not merely ancient history, but symbolic of what occurs whenever corruption grows unchecked long enough. Yet, despite the destruction, one thing survives: the Ark, a fragile structure floating through chaos. And perhaps that image explains why Noah's story still resonates so deeply across generations. Because every civilization eventually faces storms, moral storms, cultural storms, psychological storms, spiritual storms. The real question is not whether storms will come. The real question is, what kind of foundation humanity builds before they arrive? Noah built the ark before the rain began. And perhaps wisdom always requires preparation before consequences become visible. Because by the time the flood arrives, character has already been tested. The rain eventually stopped, but silence can sometimes feel more terrifying than the storm itself. Imagine the world after the flood. No cities, no crowds, no voices beyond the people inside the ark. Civilization had vanished beneath the water. Everything familiar was gone, and perhaps this is where Noah's story becomes most psychologically haunting, because surviving catastrophe does not automatically heal the human soul. Sometimes survival itself becomes its own burden. Modern people often romanticize survival. They imagine relief, gratitude, triumph. But real survivors frequently carry something far more complicated afterward: grief, trauma, emotional exhaustion. Survivor's guilt. Noah survived the flood, but he also witnessed the death of an entire world. Imagine carrying that memory. The screams, the panic, the collapse of civilization itself. Human beings are not designed to witness massive destruction without psychological consequences. Modern psychology understands this deeply. Soldiers returning from war often carry invisible wounds long after the battlefield disappears. Survivors of disasters replay traumatic memories repeatedly. Refugees carry emotional exile inside them long after escaping physically. The nervous system remembers catastrophe even when the danger has passed. Noah likely carried the flood inside his mind long after the waters receded. Another devastating consequence is loneliness. Noah's world did not merely change. It disappeared. Every familiar structure of society vanished beneath the water. Human beings depend psychologically on continuity. Familiar routines, familiar places, familiar communities. Catastrophe shatters continuity. After the flood, Noah stands inside a completely transformed reality. And perhaps this reflects one of the deepest psychological truths about loss. Sometimes people survive externally while internally feeling disconnected from the world they once knew. Many individuals experience this after major trauma, divorce, war, death of loved ones, economic collapse, pandemics. Life continues. But internally, nothing feels fully recognizable anymore. Noah may have become one of the first portraits of post-traumatic humanity. Alive, yet emotionally marked forever by catastrophe. Then another psychological burden appears: responsibility. Noah did not merely survive for himself. Humanity's future now depended on him and his family. Imagine the pressure of rebuilding civilization after witnessing civilization collapse. Human beings often underestimate how exhausting responsibility can become after trauma. Strength is not endless. Even resilient people eventually become emotionally tired. And perhaps this helps explain one of the strangest moments later in Noah's story. Noah becomes drunk. This detail shocks many readers because Noah is presented as righteous earlier. Yet perhaps this moment reveals something deeply human. Even strong people break. Modern culture often imagines moral individuals as emotionally invulnerable. But righteousness does not erase psychological pain. Noah survived the flood, but survival does not automatically remove trauma. Sometimes people who carry the heaviest burdens seek escape quietly, through alcohol, through distraction, through emotional withdrawal, through numbness. Noah's drunkenness may symbolize emotional exhaustion after prolonged suffering. And perhaps that is one reason the Bible includes the moment at all, to remind humanity that strength and brokenness can coexist inside the same person. The strongest individuals are still human. They still carry limits. They still carry wounds. Another psychological consequence of catastrophe is distrust. Before the flood, humanity trusted civilization itself. Society appeared stable, permanent, predictable. But catastrophe destroys the illusion of permanence. Noah now understands how fragile human systems truly are. Once people witness collapse directly, innocence disappears. This still happens today. Financial collapse changes how people view security. Betrayal changes how people view relationships. War changes how people view humanity itself. Trauma permanently alters perception. Noah could never again see the world with the same naive confidence as before the flood. Another painful psychological reality emerges: grief without closure. The flood did not allow gradual mourning. It erased an entire civilization suddenly. Human beings struggle deeply with overwhelming loss because the mind cannot process destruction at massive scale easily. Modern psychology understands that traumatic grief often leaves people emotionally frozen, numb, detached, unable to fully comprehend reality. Noah may have experienced profound emotional isolation even among his own family, because some experiences become difficult to explain fully to others. Trauma often creates invisible loneliness. People survive physically while feeling emotionally separated from those who did not experience the same suffering. Another consequence appears in Noah's relationship with humanity itself. Before the flood, Noah saw corruption everywhere: violence, moral collapse, collective evil. Then he witnessed destruction on unimaginable scale. Such experiences can deeply alter faith in human nature. Modern people experience this too. Witnessing cruelty repeatedly can create cynicism, emotional exhaustion, loss of trust in humanity. Some individuals become hardened after suffering because hope itself begins feeling dangerous. Noah may have wrestled internally with difficult questions. Can humanity truly change? Will civilization eventually repeat the same corruption? Was the flood an ending, or merely a temporary interruption? And perhaps history itself suggests Noah's fears would not be unfounded. Humanity rebuilds after catastrophe repeatedly, yet often carries the same internal weaknesses forward: pride, greed, violence, desire for power. The flood destroyed civilization physically, but the human heart remained complicated afterward. Another important psychological consequence is survivor's guilt. Why did Noah survive while others perished? Human beings frequently wrestle with this question after catastrophe. Survivors of war often ask why they remained alive while others died. Survivors of accidents struggle with invisible guilt despite innocence. Noah may have carried similar emotional weight silently. Survival itself can feel emotionally heavy when surrounded by massive loss. Another fascinating detail is the rainbow covenant after the flood. Symbolically, the rainbow represents reassurance after trauma. Human beings need hope after destruction. Without hope, civilizations cannot rebuild psychologically. Trauma alone cannot sustain human life. People need meaning beyond suffering. Yet, even hope after catastrophe often feels fragile. Noah now knows what humanity is capable of becoming. The flood cannot be forgotten completely. And perhaps this reflects another truth about psychological healing. Healing does not erase memory. It teaches people how to continue living despite memory. Another consequence of the flood is existential awareness. Noah witnessed the collapse of an entire world order. Such experiences force people to confront mortality deeply. Modern humanity often distracts itself from death constantly. Entertainment, productivity, consumption, noise. But catastrophe strips away distraction. Suddenly, human vulnerability becomes undeniable. Noah likely understood something afterward that many people avoid confronting. Civilization is fragile. Human life is fragile. Moral foundations matter more than societies realize. Another profound psychological lesson in Noah's story concerns emotional endurance. Noah remained faithful for decades before the flood arrived, then survived catastrophe afterward. Yet even after surviving, weakness still appears later in his life. This matters deeply because modern culture often misunderstands resilience. Resilient people are not emotionless. They are not invulnerable. Often resilience simply means continuing despite pain, continuing despite fear, continuing despite exhaustion. Noah endured emotionally overwhelming experiences, and perhaps his later brokenness reflects the accumulated weight of survival itself. Another terrifying insight from the story is this: catastrophe changes generations psychologically. Noah's children and descendants inherited a world shaped by trauma. Human history constantly repeats this cycle. Wars reshape generations. Economic collapse reshapes generations. Pandemics reshape generations. Collective suffering changes culture itself. Fear passes through families. Anxiety passes through families. Survival instincts pass through families. Humanity carries invisible psychological inheritance across generations constantly. And perhaps the flood symbolizes not only destruction, but the lasting emotional consequences civilization carries afterward. Another deeply modern aspect of Noah's story is emotional fatigue. Modern people are increasingly overwhelmed psychologically. Constant bad news, social instability, economic pressure, digital overload, loneliness, uncertainty about the future. Many individuals quietly feel exhausted internally. Noah's story reminds humanity that carrying the weight of survival can become emotionally draining even for strong people. And perhaps this is why compassion matters so deeply. Because many individuals appearing functional externally may still carry invisible floods internally. Another important psychological lesson emerges from Noah's isolation after survival. Sometimes people outgrow the world around them through suffering. Trauma changes perspective permanently. Noah could never again fully belong to the old world because the old world no longer existed. This still happens. After profound life experiences, some people return from suffering emotionally transformed while society around them continues normally. That gap creates loneliness difficult to explain. Yet, despite all the pain in Noah's story, something survives. Life itself. Hope survives. Meaning survives. Humanity survives. The ark floating above endless water becomes symbolic of something psychologically powerful. Even in overwhelming destruction, human beings continue searching for renewal. And perhaps that is why the Noah story still resonates across generations. Because every human life eventually faces floods of some kind. Grief, trauma, collapse, loneliness, suffering, uncertainty. The real question is not whether storms come. The real question is what remains inside people after the waters finally recede. Noah survived the flood, but like many survivors throughout history, part of him may have remained inside the storm forever. The story of Noah is ancient, but the psychology behind it feels disturbingly modern. Because the flood was never only about water. It was about civilization collapsing from within. And perhaps that is why the story still unsettles people thousands of years later. Modern humanity often assumes technological progress automatically means moral progress. But history repeatedly challenges that belief. Civilizations can become more advanced externally while becoming emotionally and spiritually weaker internally. Noah's world was not destroyed because humanity lacked intelligence. It was destroyed because humanity lost restraint. Violence became normal. Corruption became collective. People stopped recognizing darkness as darkness. And perhaps modern society faces similar dangers today. One of the most important lessons from Noah's story is this: societies normalize evil slowly. Human beings adapt psychologically to repeated exposure. What once shocked people eventually stops shocking them. Violence becomes entertainment. Addiction becomes culture. Dishonesty becomes politics. Exploitation becomes business. Lust becomes identity. And eventually, entire generations grow up inside systems that no longer feel morally strange because corruption has become familiar. This process still happens constantly in modern life. Social media algorithms reward outrage and division because anger captures attention. Endless stimulation weakens attention spans. Pornography reshapes intimacy. Consumer culture trains people to seek constant gratification. Human beings become emotionally numb through repetition. And perhaps that is one of the greatest dangers facing civilization. Not open evil, but gradual moral desensitization. Another major lesson from Noah's story is the psychological difficulty of standing alone. Noah spent decades resisting the direction of his society. That may sound heroic in retrospect, but psychologically, isolation is painful. Human beings naturally fear rejection. People want belonging, approval, community, which means conformity often feels emotionally safer than truth. Modern society amplifies this pressure dramatically. Online culture punishes people publicly and instantly. Fear of cancellation, humiliation, exclusion, ridicule. Many individuals silence themselves to avoid social consequences. Noah reminds humanity that moral courage often requires loneliness, because truth is not always popular. And perhaps one of the deepest tests of character is whether a person can maintain integrity without applause. Another lesson from Noah's story concerns pleasure culture. The world before the flood appears consumed by appetite and self-interest. Modern civilization increasingly moves in similar directions. Endless entertainment, endless scrolling, endless dopamine. Human attention has become one of the most exploited resources on Earth. Entire industries compete to keep people distracted continuously. Why? Because distracted people are easier to control, easier to market to, easier to emotionally manipulate. Yet endless pleasure often weakens discipline over time. Human beings become less capable of silence, reflection, patience, restraint. Noah's story quietly warns that civilizations obsessed with immediate gratification eventually lose long-term vision. This is why many people today feel emotionally restless despite constant stimulation. Pleasure is abundant, peace is not. Another important modern lesson is this: warnings are usually ignored until consequences arrive. Humanity has always struggled with delayed consequences. People assume there is still time, nothing will happen, everything will continue normally. But many collapses happen slowly before suddenly becoming irreversible. Climate instability, mental health crises, social fragmentation, debt, addiction, loneliness. These warning signs often appear long before visible catastrophe. Yet societies resist uncomfortable truth because transformation requires sacrifice. Noah built the ark before the rain began. Modern humanity often waits until floods already arrive before reacting. Another deeply modern aspect of Noah's story is emotional exhaustion. Many people today quietly feel overwhelmed internally. Constant bad news, constant comparison, economic pressure, social instability, digital overload. The human nervous system was never designed for non-stop stimulation. Yet modern civilization rarely allows psychological rest. People are connected constantly, yet feel increasingly isolated emotionally. Noah's Ark floating through endless water becomes symbolic of survival inside emotional chaos. Many modern people feel exactly like that, drifting through uncertainty while trying to preserve sanity, meaning, and hope. Another powerful lesson from Noah concerns leadership. Noah led his family through a collapsing world. Leadership during crisis requires emotional stability, discipline, and long-term thinking. But modern culture often rewards charisma more than character, visibility more than wisdom, performance more than integrity. Yet civilizations eventually suffer when leadership lacks moral foundation. Noah represents a very different model. Quiet responsibility, perseverance, integrity without applause. Perhaps modern society desperately needs more leaders willing to build arcs instead of merely entertaining crowds. Another lesson from the flood story is the fragility of civilization itself. Modern people often assume society is permanent because systems appear stable. But history repeatedly shows how quickly stability can disappear. Economic collapse, war, pandemics, social unrest, natural disasters. Human systems are far more fragile than people realize. Noah's story reminds humanity not to place absolute faith in external structures alone, because civilizations survive not only through technology, but through moral trust, discipline, responsibility, and shared meaning. Once those foundations weaken, external power cannot fully hold society together. Another deeply relevant lesson is the importance of protecting inner life. Noah built a physical ark, but psychologically, every human being needs some form of internal ark today. A place where truth survives, where attention survives, where conscience survives, where identity survives despite cultural chaos. Modern civilization constantly competes for human attention and desire. Without inner discipline, people become shaped entirely by external pressure. Noah represents resistance against that pressure, the willingness to preserve meaning even when society drifts toward confusion. Another uncomfortable lesson from Noah's story is this: civilization can become morally blind while still appearing successful externally. Wealth does not guarantee wisdom. Technology does not guarantee maturity. Entertainment does not guarantee happiness. Humanity can advance materially while collapsing psychologically. Perhaps that is why modern society often feels strangely empty despite abundance. People consume more than ever, yet many feel disconnected from meaning, because the human soul requires more than stimulation. It requires purpose, truth, belonging, responsibility, hope. Noah's story also teaches something important about resilience. Resilience does not mean emotional invulnerability. Noah himself later breaks. Emotionally, even righteous people carry wounds. Even strong people become exhausted. Modern culture often pressures individuals to appear constantly successful and emotionally stable. But real strength sometimes means simply continuing despite fear and uncertainty. And perhaps this is one reason the Noah story still resonates so deeply. Because many people today feel they are trying to preserve something fragile inside a world becoming increasingly chaotic. Their peace, their values, their humanity, their ability to think clearly, their capacity to love, their faith, their sanity. Noah's Ark becomes symbolic of protecting what matters most while storms rage outside. And maybe that is the greatest modern lesson hidden in the story. Every generation eventually faces floods of some kind. Moral floods, psychological floods, cultural floods. The real question is not whether chaos will come. The real question is this: what are human beings building before it arrives? Perhaps the story of Noah was never only about a flood. Perhaps it was always about civilization itself. About humanity standing at the edge of its own corruption without realizing how close collapse truly is. Because every generation believes it is more advanced than the ones before it. Smarter, safer, more enlightened. Yet history repeats a haunting pattern. Civilizations often become strongest externally shortly before weakening internally. Empires rise. Technology expands. Wealth increases. Entertainment multiplies. And slowly, almost invisibly, something deeper begins disappearing. Wisdom, restraint, meaning, moral clarity. The world before the flood may have looked powerful from the outside, but internally, humanity had already begun drowning. And perhaps that is the true warning hidden in Noah's story. Civilizations do not collapse only because enemies attack them. Sometimes they collapse because they lose the ability to govern themselves. Noah represents something extraordinarily rare in human history. A person willing to preserve truth while surrounded by collective corruption. And perhaps that is why he appears so isolated. Because people who resist the direction of society are often misunderstood before they are remembered. Noah built the ark, while everyone else continued distracting themselves, laughing, consuming, ignoring warning signs. And maybe modern humanity behaves similarly more often than people want to admit. Endless entertainment, endless stimulation, endless distraction, yet rising loneliness, rising anxiety, rising emotional exhaustion. Humanity has never been more connected technologically, yet many people feel spiritually disconnected from themselves, from others, and from meaning itself. Perhaps modern civilization is not lacking information. Perhaps it is lacking wisdom. And maybe that is why Noah's story still feels disturbingly relevant. Because the flood symbolizes something larger than ancient destruction. It symbolizes what happens when human appetite grows stronger than human conscience. When pleasure replaces purpose. When crowds replace truth. When comfort becomes more important than character. Yet, despite all the darkness in the story, there is also something profoundly hopeful hidden inside it. The ark survives. Life survives. Meaning survives. Humanity survives. Noah's Ark becomes more than a wooden structure floating on water. It becomes a symbol of preservation, preserving morality while society drifts, preserving conscience while culture becomes numb, preserving truth while crowds mock it. And perhaps every generation must build some kind of ark, not necessarily from wood, but internally. An ark protecting integrity, discipline, wisdom, compassion, attention, humanity itself. Because modern life constantly floods people psychologically. Floods of noise, floods of distraction, floods of anger, floods of comparison, floods of endless consumption. And without something stable internally, human beings slowly drift wherever culture carries them. Maybe that is why Noah's isolation matters so much. He reminds humanity that sometimes truth requires standing apart from the crowd, and that loneliness, while painful, may also preserve the soul. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of the story is this. The flood did not permanently remove human weakness. Humanity survives, but the same desires, the same pride, the same corruption, eventually return again throughout history, which suggests the greatest battle was never only external. The real flood has always existed inside the human heart. The flood of greed, the flood of ego, the flood of violence, the flood of endless desire without restraint. Civilization repeatedly tries to solve external problems while ignoring internal ones. But perhaps no society can remain healthy when the human soul itself becomes corrupted. And maybe that is the final philosophical question Noah leaves behind. Can humanity truly save itself from its own nature? Or will every civilization eventually drift toward the same moral exhaustion if wisdom disappears? Perhaps the story of Noah survives because deep down, humanity senses something fragile about itself. The awareness that progress alone is not enough. That intelligence alone is not enough. That power alone is not enough. Human beings still need meaning, still need truth, still need moral foundations strong enough to survive the storms that inevitably come. And maybe the real lesson of Noah is not about fearing another flood from the sky. Perhaps the real lesson is this. Every generation must decide whether it will continue drifting with the current of corruption, or begin building an ark before the waters rise.